Welcome to Gideon's Promise, the podcast with Jonathan Rapping. In the landmark 1963 decision Gideon v. Wainwright, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously ruled every person accused of a crime in America must be provided a lawyer, regardless of their ability to pay. This podcast is about the people that uphold that promise, public defenders. These dedicated lawyers give voice to 80% of the people thrown into the system, and yet in the national discussion regarding justice reform, public defenders are largely overlooked. This show centers public defenders in that conversation. We will explore the critical role public defenders play in addressing a wide range of issues facing marginalized communities with subject matter experts, key opinion leaders, and people impacted by the American criminal legal system. Listen as a community of advocates discuss their work to strengthen public defenders and transform public defense.
So welcome, everyone. We are really excited to launch the next episode of our podcast with two really amazing guests. I'm excited to introduce two criminal justice reformers. First of all, David Lee Windecher. David was a student of mine at Atlanta's John Marshall Law School before becoming a criminal defense attorney here in Atlanta, but more than a criminal defense attorney, he's been a criminal justice reformer. He's been on the board or serves on the board of advisors for the Georgia Justice Project and is the founder of Rehabilitation Enables Dreams, Inc., also known as R.E.D, based here in Atlanta. They do amazing work. David will tell us a little bit more about that. He's also the author of The American Dream, His Story in the Making, which I urge people to get to really learn a lot more about David's incredible journey. David, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you guys for having me. You know, not only was I one of your students, but I was also a longtime fan of Gideon's Promise. I mean, I understood the landmark case because I was an indigent individual. I was also an immigrant. So I was working for the Miami Dolphins in 2007, and that's when I discovered Gideon's Promise, or 2008. And I've been following ever since, you know, and then to know that you're the professor at John Marshall, and then I get out and here I am at your podcast. It's kind of a bit surreal for me. It's been an interesting journey to get to this podium.
Well, good, man. And now I'm looking up to you. And as well as looking up to you, I'm also really looking up to our second guest, Tyra Patterson, the amazing Tyra Patterson, who is the Community Outreach Strategy Specialist at the Ohio Justice Policy Center, based in Cincinnati, Ohio, where she works closely with David Singleton, who was a guest in a previous show with us. Tyra also is a criminal justice reformer. She is someone who's developed a national platform, really, as a speaker, as a teacher, more recently as an advocate through her amazing op-eds. Tyra, I think you've published 2 now. Is that right?
I published 3 now.
3. Yes. So Tyra is really just an incredible advocate. And the reason why we wanted to bring Tyra and David together today is because, as you know, we are an organization that loves, supports, works with public defenders. Both David and Tyra really have an incredible amount of love and respect for public defenders, but they're also incredible reformers, and their introduction to the criminal legal system actually started well before they were reformers. They both had their own experiences with the system as children, right? And so, Illy, let me turn it over to you, and maybe you can talk to them a little bit about that experience.
Yeah, so just interested in, and David, we'll start with you. You mentioned, and I know your story, but you said your first introduction was around 11 years old. Can you just kind of share your experience, what happened, and how did that shape you? How did that experience shape you?
Sure. So I had just moved to the United States from Buenos Aires, Argentina in 1989. It's January 1990. There is talks at the school about this big pickup flag football game. And so my brother and I want to go to this game, but we had one bicycle that my dad bought for us. We were really poor. We couldn't purchase a second bike. And the bicycle that we had actually had a stripped gooseneck. That means that the handlebars pivot forward or backwards, so I couldn't tow my brother or vice versa. So we would need to get a set of pegs to tow each other. to this park that was several miles away from the home. And, I made a mistake. I knew I couldn't ask my parents for money to buy a set of pegs because came Thursday, the refrigerator was empty. And on a day after school, there was this big game, and I decided to go to a retail store. I rode the bike there. I walked inside. I took a set of pegs. I ran out, got on the bike, started pedaling like the wind, and unfortunately, the handlebar went forward. I fell off, and the owner of the Megacycle store is what it was called, was behind me in pursuit. So picked me up, arrested me. They took me to a juvenile court. They adjudicated me delinquent at age 11. They put me on probation. They made me do theft deterrent programs, community service hours. And so the system taught me to resent my life more than anything. It didn't help me cope with my financial circumstances. It just made me feel like I'm a poor individual and I'm a criminal. That's what the system taught me. It made me feel like that's what I was here to do, is to break the law and be in and out of the court system. I had never once in my life even seen a courthouse. And so my first experience with them was that they were punitive, that they were looking to lock me up. They were so angry that they called me defendant, they called me probationer, they called me, these names that made you feel like, oh, so this is why I came to America. That's kind of what it felt like for me. And so I became a shadow of myself. I'm pretty social. I'm an extrovert. And that experience just made me a shell of myself. I became introverted because first of all, I couldn't have any friends. I'm a father now for the first time of a 1-year-old, and I kind of get it that I wouldn't want my 11-year-old hanging out with another 11-year-old on probation who has an adjudication of delinquency. And so I understood. And those 2 years before I made it to middle school were really tough because my dad had to work extra hours just to pay those dues, and it felt like it was my fault. So for a family that was already struggling financially, this whole case exacerbated our financial woes, and it sent me off into a dark place.
Okay. Thank you so much, David, for sharing that. And Tyra, what about you? Can you share your experience in the system, and how did that experience shape you to be the person that you are today?
Absolutely. And I'm so sorry that happened to you, David, at the age of 11. That's tragic, especially when you were just a baby. So I was wrongfully convicted in 1994. And of course, we all know that the world was a much different place as it relates to social justice. I was given a 43-year life sentence at the age of 18 for a wrongful conviction of aggravated murder and 5 counts of aggravated robbery. And today I go around the country speaking about changing the ecosystem for people impacted directly by incarceration. Today I'm trying to find my voice after being silenced for so long. I hope that when you see me, you can see the people who are directly impacted. And it's a huge responsibility. And some of the things that I do today with the Ohio Justice and Policy Center is we're quite the opposite of the Innocence Project. And I love what we do. We represent those who have actually made mistakes and have given me a different outlook for life itself, because so many people love the word innocence. And when it comes to guilt, people want to write off people. So I make it my mission to humanize those who have been directly impacted or who is in prison. It's a hard task, but it's something that I'm very passionate about. I'm very passionate about tokenism and exploitation. Something David said earlier. He said people call him a convicted felon and an inmate and stuff like that. Like that really hinders our growth in the world. So today I strive for a different outlook for others and for myself.
So let me ask you, David, I know you talked about your first contact with the system being at 11, but you then had a significant number of experiences with the criminal legal system before ultimately going to college and becoming a lawyer, right?
Right.
How many more times did you end up in the criminal system?
I was arrested the first time at 11, and then from 14 to 19, I accumulated another 12 arrests. So it was a 13 total arrests by the age of 19. I spent 8 months incarcerated. And my worst case was when I was charged as an adult on a direct file in Miami-Dade County, and I was facing 15 years in prison on an aggravated battery. So I spent some good time getting to see how the public defender office operates. 12 times specifically. In juvenile court, 11 years old, they didn't assign me anybody, or maybe I just don't remember. But I think I would remember as traumatizing as it was. I know what Tyra was talking about. I completely understand the psychological effects. But yeah, so by the time I was 19, I had 13 arrests and 8 months behind bars.
Yeah. And Tyra, you spent 23 years in prison. What always amazes me about you, Tyra, is, that would have crushed the spirit of almost anybody, and yet I don't know anyone who's got a stronger spirit than you. And you came out after 23 years, and in really a short period of time have done more with your life to make change in the criminal legal system than many people do in an entire lifetime. Tell us about what you're doing now, your work with the Ohio Justice Policy Center, your reform work, and why you felt so compelled to come right from 23 years in prison and jump into the reform work sort of as really as zealously as you have.
What got me through my incarcerations was people like you, John. Like, people had to come inside the prison and humanize me. David Singleton, which is a public defender, was the only person who saw me and fought for me. So that alone gave me hope. But before I went to prison, I was uneducated. I was a 11-year-old dropout. And that came from being poor, a minority, and living in the marginalized communities where I had to take my education had to take a back seat to survival. So whenever I went to prison, I didn't know how to read or write, but I wanted to know what went wrong in my case because something went wrong. So while I was incarcerated, I started educating myself. But while doing that, I had to become an advocate for other people who was inside as well as myself. So David fought for my release, but when I got home, I said, I'm not the only Tyra Patterson. I wanted to change the ecosystem for returning citizens. And what better way to find somebody who is directly impacted? Because oftentimes people ask our opinions after the decisions have been made, and I wanted that to change. So some of the things that I've been doing is like the intersection of art and social justice. I wanted to make sure that when we come home, we're not just relegated to menial jobs. I wanted people to give us meaningful opportunities. Because again, I am not the only Tyra out here. I was offered a job in the legal field. I'm grateful for that, but is that really systemic change? So I'm doing things now that will allow people to have opportunity. They say that we have resources out there, but where are they? So that's what I'm passionate about.
And David, you mentioned, and it's interesting because Tyra just mentioned the 11, right, and dropping out. You mentioned 11 as your first exposure to the criminal legal system, and then you all changed. You pivoted in terms of your pathway.
Right.
And so now, Dave, as a teenager, you said 12 to 13 times in and out of the system or exposed to the system. And now you're the executive director of R.E.D, right? Rehabilitation Enables Dreams. So how did that transformation happen?
There were a lot of catalysts in my life. One, I'm faith-based, and that was kind of, I stopped caring to try to figure it out for myself, and I wanted to believe in God, so I gave my life to Him and said, "You figure this out. What do with me what you will." And that was kind of my angle, and I started praying for purpose. That was one thing, and then the other thing that stuck out to me was that I was getting different results than my Hispanic and African American counterparts. I'd get probation, they get jail time. And I wasn't smart enough to figure out why back then. But just kind of like Tyra was saying, we're one of so many. And I don't want to be the exception. I want to be the rule. One of my big motivators was that there's no reason why someone that has darker skin color than I do should have the same opportunities that I do. And I will continue to fight until the day that I know that someone that's black or brown with a criminal record as egregious as mine, I want the system to look at people and feel like they can be rehabilitated. They're better than their circumstances. If we invest in them rather than bet against them, they will self-actualize. And that's what I fight for. I believe that people are better than their worst circumstances or their worst decision. And I may have been stealing that quote from Brian Stevenson to some extent. He said that, and he inspired me to say that. But, I met a guy named Ray Hinton, who's one of his exonerees, not too long ago. Back in February, I think I met him. And I always used to say, the system is broken because of what it's doing to so many people. And he said, stop saying that. The system is not broken. The system is doing exactly what the system is supposed to do. And so to answer your question, I think that the attack is on the lower socioeconomic environment because people there can't fend for themselves. They don't have access to resources like Tyra was mentioning. And so if you can't educate yourself, or if the educational system in that in that socioeconomic environment is poor and doesn't help you, what do? You pick yourself up by your bootstraps, as they want you to do in this country. And so that's why I pivoted. I went from making all of these bad decisions to trying to do the right thing. I asked God for purpose, and I believe He had a purpose in mind for me. Clearly now I know what that is. And I was inspired by the black and brown people that were being destroyed by a punitive system that in 1994 was at the height of the Get Tough on Crime bill.
Yes.
So, those are some of my motivations. I mean, I could go all day on this, but and then just the fact that I know what police officers are doing and what they were doing when I was a kid, the money they would take from me, the drugs they would take from me, and tell me it's my lucky day. I used to think it was my lucky day, but now I realize that corruption is so rampant in the system and it's so deeply rooted that it's a reason why you have these outcomes. And so you have to address so many different things simultaneously in order to fix this, and I feel like I have the energy to be a part of the solution.
I appreciate that. And as a person of color, I truly appreciate your thoughtfulness and really helping to support people who oftentimes do not have a voice in the system.
I do too.
And this also leads me to what you both mentioned about your experience in the system and public defenders, right? And so your experience, David, as you said, you may have, you may not, you can't even remember because it was just so much. And Tyra, your personal experience. So I'll start with you, Tyra. Why are public defenders so critical right now in this in this criminal justice reform movement?
Because people don't have the money, they still deserve a good defense. And that's one thing that I love about the Gideon's Promise is I've been there. I've held classes there, and it was always a welcoming experience. And those who have been in your classes have always reached out to ask the best questions of how to humanize their clients. And that's something that we didn't have back in the early 1990s. They didn't care. I mean, it was just this stigma that if you are in prison, you are guilty without second guessing us or without acting like our prosecutors. So today the teachings are needed because a lot of people, especially in our Black and brown communities, don't have the money to be represented.
And David, what about you? What do you think about public defenders in this criminal justice reform movement?
You know what I'm doing right now? I'm going back to those days in my head. And, this is what I remember. I remember the public defender being the only person in the courtroom that was standing up for me. Mm-hmm. There's a probation officer, a deputy, a judge, a prosecutor. Everybody felt like they were against me. And the only person that was speaking up for me or trying to fight for me was the public defender. And that's my memory. That the one person in a full courtroom that would say something on my behalf and try to fight for me was that person. And so once I realized that, I started listening to their words. And when I started listening to their words, it made sense to me. And that's when I started realizing that maybe I can do this too one day. Mm-hmm. And so I was inspired by them. They're in a courtroom full of people, and they're the only person fighting in one direction for justice, whereas everybody else is against it. That's what it felt like. It felt like it was everybody else against me. And so, I don't know. I just feel like the public defender helped shape my focus regarding my education. And I'm so thankful for them for that. That's why I said I've always looked at the first thing I knew in my entire life about what a lawyer does is learning what the public defender was.
And so you have love for public defenders, David.
Oh, you have no idea. I mean, I do. When people talk the public defender, they're the worst attorneys. Do you really know what they're up against? Do you want to just say that because you repeated it somewhere? Have you talked to somebody? Do you know what they go through? Do you know their lack of access to resource? I mean, the state has everything at their disposal.
Right.
And this public defender has to go and do whatever they can to make ends meet. And whatever those ends are, they need them. Because without those, they can't properly represent someone. And so, you get Gideon. And ever since Gideon, there has been no advancements in indigent representation. There has been none. What other case has established any type of benefit for indigent folks after Gideon?
And David, when you say Gideon, just for our listeners, you're talking about the U.S. Supreme Court ruling in 1963, Gideon v. Wainwright.
Right.
Yeah. And so, Tyra, you have love for public defenders, and your experience really initially was with David Singleton, right, the executive director of the Ohio Justice and Policy Center. But I think it was shortly, 6 months from your release, you ended up speaking at a room full of 200 public defenders at Gideon's Promise, right, shortly after your release. So why do you have love for public defenders?
And can I just, before you answer that, Tyra, Illy said your first experience was David Singleton. David Singleton came in after you were incarcerated. You actually had experience, unlike David, with a public defender that really didn't do such a good job for you. Isn't that right?
And that is right. And I was gonna say that, like, I have never, I didn't have the best experience, and it goes back to me not being educated because I didn't speak the King's language, and because we didn't have a Gideon's Promise to teach culture competencies, I was impacted by that. And it wasn't until 20 years later, after my incarceration, that a public defender came in to humanize me and fight for me. And he fought relentlessly. And that made me change my perspective on public defenders, because when you're incarcerated, I had a different experience than David, and that makes this conversation great, because when we're incarcerated, we talk about public pretenders. You all are not representing us because you all believe in us. It's just something that you all have to do, but that's not true. That is not true because of Gideon's Promise. I believe in my heart. A lot of people in prison now didn't have a fair shake when it came to public defenders. And I'm one of the lucky ones to have David Singleton and have you guys in my name. My public defenders didn't even know my name. Today, they wrote affidavits and on the behalf of me. But back then, like I said earlier, they didn't have the culture competency to represent me.
And Tyra, you actually serve now as a faculty member for Gideon's Promise. Can you just tell our audience about what you do in that capacity and how you train some of our, I call baby lawyers, or our new lawyers in the program?
Yes, I love to teach. I love to teach about humanizing your clients and language. Language matters. Some of the things that you all do with your teachers, it's different when somebody who has been directly impacted to teach us about the legalese. A lot of times public defenders or attorneys come inside the prison and they talk over our head when we don't understand. We don't understand the legalese. So break it down for us. Like we make sure that we understand what you all are presenting to us so that we can make the decisions with you all, so that we can fight alongside of you all, instead of thinking that we have been to college like you. And so it's something that Gideon's Promise gravitates towards, and I love to be in those rooms to answer any of those questions, because I was one of those people that didn't understand when my public defenders came into the room and they would talk above my head.
Can I chime in on something there?
Sure.
Yeah.
What's interesting, it stands out to me there, is that Tyra said that the public defender didn't even know her name, and then that they were speaking in legalese. And I understand, here's why. Based on jurisdiction, they may not have time to learn your name. Based on their timing, they may not have the time to break it down to layman terms because they have to go on and help the next client. And this is what I mean by I want the public defenders to have equal access to resources, because some of them are trying to do the best that they can. And I know this because while I'm sitting in a jail with my one case I got to handle this week, you know, they're over there scrambling. I'm like, hey, what's going on? How you doing? Blah, blah, blah. They're talking fast to me. You know, they're trying to brush me off. And that's what I mean. It's not fair. You don't see that being a challenge for the state where they're in such a hurry or they don't have the time to really thoroughly review their case. And that's what I think when I hear those things, because Tyra's not the only person that says that. A lot of people say that. Oh, they didn't even know my name. They didn't know the facts about the case until they sat right next to me. Well, there's a reason for that. And I think we need to level that playing field to make their job easier so they don't have to stress and they don't have to rush through. Because to break something down into layman's terms that you know in legalese, that you operate in that capacity every single day, going back to layman terms, it's a job, it's a task, it's a chore.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And David, can I add one thing that I love about public defenders today, especially David Singleton. When he came in, our very first meeting shouldn't be about what did you do or what didn't they do. It should be about coming in, what's your name? Let me tell you a little bit about my family, because we're vulnerable. And I want to see somebody else's vulnerability before I share my whole life story with them. And that's another thing that he did. And that helped his defense to get me out, because then he was able to learn about the 911 call and about other things that people didn't pay attention to, because he paid attention to me as a human. And that was very important.
You got to know her. That's awesome. You know, David Singleton's Twitter account is going to get a bunch of followers.
It should. Yeah, it should. So you know, Tyra, I love that you say that, because I think, you know, you understand that so well from the experience you had with David, and I think that's something you bring to Gideon's Promise, and you then teach our public defenders to appreciate and to understand that you can't be afraid of vulnerability, that you have to develop relationships, that the pressures David describes are real. Well-intentioned people get 300 cases and have to figure out how to move through and process those cases. And I think what we try to teach at Gideon's Promise, and Tyra, what I think you're so good at teaching, is thinking about the toll that takes on the people you're serving, and you might lose sight of it. I appreciate this conversation so much. One more thing before I get on to a question for you, David, I wanted to ask you, Tyra, very quickly. You are in such demand. I mean, recently they painted a mural of you in Cincinnati, right? You're doing photo shoots. You're speaking all across the country. You're mentoring children.
She has a documentary coming out.
It's a documentary coming out. And yet, you know, whenever we call, you find time for Gideon's Promise. And I appreciate that, because I think one thing that we've been trying to do at Gideon's Promise is point out the fact that in this national conversation about criminal justice reform, public defenders are often ignored. And yet you make it a priority. So I just want to thank you for that, because it means a lot.
Somebody had to leverage their privilege for me. And now that I'm able to leverage my privilege for others, I will find the time. Because if we don't, then I am no better than the next person who created the system. I want my experience to be a learning experience, not just for my freedom, but for others to come.
No,
I'm following Tyra.
And anytime you all come.
David's over here. He got his phone out.
David is following you on Twitter.
Oh, good,
Tyra,
David.
what's
I'll
that handle?
do this thing.
What's the handle, Tyra?
Tyra Imani. Tyra Imani.
All right, I'm glad you two have become friends. So
Absolutely, I am too.
So, David, man, I want to ask you about this, because I knew you as a law student, and you know, I could tell when you were a law student you had an incredible amount of potential. I could tell you were going to go on to do big things, but to be honest, I don't know that I could have predicted that you would be doing as much as you are doing. I mean, with R.E.D, with the work you do in courtrooms across Georgia and even beyond, your work with the Georgia Justice Project. But in addition to that, I think what is so amazing is you're a mentor. You have really taken seriously the obligation to reach out to other people, and particularly people who themselves have been court impacted.
Sure.
And to help them get to where you've been able to get to. And I mention that because right here in this room, as we're taping this podcast, you brought Cal Lewis. Cal is a first-year law student at Atlanta's John Marshall Law School. He's there because, in large part, because he was working with you. He was interested in becoming a lawyer. You really helped him navigate the system and get to John Marshall. Right? Soon he will be a student of mine, as you were. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of why you make that a priority, investing in folks that have had the same challenges you've had.
First of all, thanks, Rap, for the kind words. That really means a lot, because one thing that I've learned is that you want to project in a way that people experience you in a way that they look at you like someone that contributes to society. So hearing you say those things about me means that you experience me in a way that it feels like I'm trying to do the best that I can to help our communities be better than I found them, right? Well, my community was difficult that I grew up in. I grew up in rampant poverty, a lot of police corruption, a lot of wrongful arrests, a lot of all that stuff. And I remember the breaks that I would get because of my situation, my skin color. And I thought about how unfair that is to the black and brown kids. So when I started R.E.D, I knew that because of my experience in the criminal justice system, that the majority were going to be black and brown kids. And I know how to relate to them well because I grew up in the same environment. Now I walk in a suit and they'll think, who's this guy? He's got no kind of connection to us, no common ground, nothing. But I go in there, tell them my story, and I roll up my sleeves and I'll show them my tattoos. And the reason it's important for them to hear my story is because what I want them to understand is that if I can get there, they can get there too. I'm just a few steps ahead of them. They have to be willing to continue to put those hard, difficult steps forward on a regular basis. The difference between the 90s when I was going through the system and now is that you can't fake the desire to help everyone that's going through the system. Now we know that we're pursuing equal justice, restorative justice, black, brown, white. That doesn't matter anymore. You can't get away with treating someone incorrectly because of their skin color. And with Cal, man, I don't think Cal realizes how much I talk about him. This is the way we met. We rented out the Georgia Dome to do our flag football event with, the people in the community and police officers, which we had the Gideon's logo up there. Which
I thank you for that. I thank you.
No problem. I love seeing it up there. It's like, and you as a kid, you would never think that it's possible, right? But you can do those things if you work hard. And so my message to the kids in our group, or the students is what I call them. I don't call them defendants, to Tyra's point about certain vernaculars. Anyway, so I'm just a few steps ahead of them. But the reality is to show them how to take those steps. Mentoring is so important. Cal gets out after a 5-year bid in 2016, and he hears about my tournament. He shows up at the tournament. I'm running around like a chicken with no head. And so he gives me a little tidbit. I'm like, that dude is interesting. And that resulted in us grabbing lunch. And that lunch went from like, hey, we got from 12 to 12:45, then I got to get out of here, till I don't even know. I think we were probably like 3 or 4 hours there talking. And I was inspired by Cal. His energy, his mindset, his outlook. You could see the scars that his experiences caused him, not physically, but like you could hear him. And I was just touched by his desire to want to do more, and not just for himself, for others. And so I wanted to be a part of Cal's life and mentoring him. And, at this point, I consider him a friend more than anything, but I like spending time with him because he brings value. He brings value from, if he does it, and I always tell him this, like I told you guys, I'm not going to stop until I see a black person with a criminal record like mine or worse that has gotten a license to practice law. I'm counting the days down. I'm counting the days down because he'll be the first one that I know. And so I will be there with him throughout this whole process. And same for the kids in our program. I think that if you want to lift others onto higher ground, you need to be in the trenches with them and show them how it's done. Because mentors, I'm 41 years old and I still have a mentor. So mentors are key components. All of the stuff that we provide, educational resources, access to other resources, without a mentor, you couldn't really tap into them and learn how to actualize based on access. And so I think mentors are critical.
And this seems to go
Oh, my God, they are.
Hey, I'm 54 and Tyra's my mentor.
I was just gonna, go ahead, Tyra. I'm sorry.
It's something that he said, he want to continue to mentor Kyle, and the way he had this relationship with him. Whenever I got out, David didn't just free me. They gave me an opportunity. And trust me, guys, I felt intimidated. Coming from prison, here's this Harvard grad and other Harvard grads in the room, and I felt inadequate. But they made me feel good. They accepted me. And I had to realize within myself that I was the expert in the room, right?
Right.
So good for you, David, for Cal. I'm looking forward to that as well.
Yeah, Cal's a great guy. I mean, he's got a certain energy about him. And when he speaks, people listen because he talks to you like in layman terms, like we were talking about when, he addresses folks. But he's got a certain energy about him. His energy is that it doesn't matter what happened to me. It doesn't matter what I've experienced, but I'm going to be a part of this world and I'm going to contribute no matter how much effort I have to put in. And that stuff is infectious.
Good. Then now that you've talked him up, when he takes Crim Pro with me next year, I'm expecting an A, nothing less.
Yeah.
Well, I think you should just give him an A rap. I mean, I don't know if that's ethical, but I think just in life experience alone, I truly believe he should get an A. I'm wondering if David got it. No, okay, I don't want him to get his license revoked. I got automatic A's.
It's so funny you say that because I was really focused on the criminal classes, but the other classes, I'd just be honest, I wanted to get practical experience. They're trying to teach me business law, and I'm thinking, you know what, I just want to be in a courtroom.
Yeah. Well, I think that the thing I think Tyra mentioned it earlier about just having the opportunity and being in a space and be privileged enough to help lift others. And I think it is important. And, the adage I live by is Congressman Shirley Chisholm is service is the rent you pay for time here on this earth. And so anybody that I run into that is doing that service, I am just so humbled to be in their presence. So this is just exciting to me, and I'm going to try not to cry. I'm a little emotional this weekend. Tyra makes me cry every time she speaks, so it's a great thing.
Stop it, Elle.
So I got a couple more questions, and just to talk about. So you all have just taken this opportunity we're currently in this huge movement for Black lives, this huge racial justice movement. More people are looking at criminal justice reform than I have ever. Rap and I get phone calls after phone calls, and people are interested. And our public defenders are really struggling right now, right? Our public defenders some of them are still in court. Right? Their courts have not closed. Some of them are going into the jail so they can get people released who are, as you know, the rampant increase in COVID cases are happening in the jails. And they're just tired. And they were already struggling before this pandemic, before the racial justice movement. And so I just want, if you two can just what message would you give to public defenders in terms of keep going? And Tyra, I'm going to start with you. What can you say to encourage our public defenders that are out there?
I would say do the best you can. Do the best you can. As long as we know that you all are keeping us hopeful while we're inside and you're fighting for us and you're not saying, well, I have to hand your case over to someone else after I've learned all about your situation, because that's dropping the ball on somebody. So as long as you're transparent with us so that we can continue to be transparent with you all and just say, hey, have patience with me. I know it's not working out right now, but I'm doing the best I can, but just don't drop the ball on us. And that alone gives us hope. That gives us another way to fight.
And David, what about you? What message would you give to the public defenders who are struggling?
First, I'd like to say thank you to them, because I know that they're doing work that is extremely important, and without their efforts, we wouldn't be heading into the right direction. And second, I would say hang in there and keep fighting, because help is on the way. So what I would say is just keep showing up, keep doing this difficult work. It's not aimless. It is getting results. And the people who are here on the outside fighting for leveling the playing field, we're not going to quit. We just need to make sure that you don't quit, because these second chance laws, all of these type of legislations that we're interested in to prevent from the locking up of nonviolent offenders is going to benefit them. And we're not too far from that. We're getting very, very close to creating laws that will look at nonviolent offenders as less of a threat to our communities, and therefore there'll be resolutions that do not include incarceration. So therefore the cases don't have the kind of pressure that you would feel when you know you're going to look at lockup. And when those things start happening, their resources will free up. So they'll have more time. They'll be able to learn those clients' names. They'll be able to speak to them in layman terms. They'll be able to spend more time and humanize the relationship a little bit more. So go ahead, Tyra.
I'm so sorry. I thought,
Okay.
second chances are real. Making a difference between violent and nonviolent offenders is harmful to the fight against mass incarceration. Second chances should belong to everyone.
I want to first thank you, Tyra Imani Patterson from the Ohio Justice Policy Center for joining us today. Thank you so much. David Windecher is the Executive Director of R.E.D. Rehabilitation Enables Dreams here in Atlanta, Georgia. I want to thank you both for joining us on Gideon's Promise, the podcast. And in true form or fashion rap, this is Ilham Askia.
And this is Jonathan Rapping.
Wrapping it up.
Oh, that was cute.
Hey, Il, before we hit that outro, why don't you tell people how to order a copy of the book in your radio voice?
In my radio voice?
Yeah, in your radio voice.
Okay. Get your copy of Gideon's Promise, a public defender movement to transform criminal justice at Amazon, IndieBound, Beacon Press, or wherever books are sold. Pre-order today, and a portion of proceeds will help us support public defenders.
Oh, that was good. That was good.
Thank you for listening to Gideon's Promise, the podcast, with Jonathan Rapping. For more information on the topics covered and featured guests, please visit our website at gideonspromise.org. And finally, please subscribe, share, and let us know what you think.